Hey everyone, welcome back with this video where we're going to continue our conversation on forms. In a previous video, I introduced forms and several of the key fields that we're going to need in order to get forms to work. But where we left off was our form wasn't quite working, and that's because we didn't have some of the attributes that we really needed in order for our form to work properly. So as a quick reminder, let's take a look. I'm going to continue our Week 10 demo forms with the forms.html page. I'll open my preview and my live server right away. Let me fill in my form and select Order Pizza. So this was our green screen that we had gotten to. Now normally our form should be sending our data to the server and then display what that content was on our green echo page. The server isn't receiving the data because we're missing an important piece. The name attribute. There are a lot of attributes that we can add to our input elements to enhance the form, and the textbook lists out several of them in more detail. We're going to cover the key ones that are most important for this course. Let me do a little resizing and clean up our view so we can really get down into these attributes. So last time we had covered the inputs where the type was going to be equal to text, an input for a type equal to password, and we did text area. We also did buttons for where the input type was equal to submit and to reset. Now each of these plays a very key role, but what our inputs in our text area doesn't have is a name attribute so that we can contain the information inside of it and pass it over to the server. The name attribute acts like a container or a variable to hold the data we enter in and send it to the application that's on the server. Without our name attribute, our data doesn't go anywhere. Let's take a look at this in an example. We're going to add a name attribute to each one of our fields. I'm going to start by using nonsensical or non-meaningful values just to give you an example of what you should not do. Now the name attribute is inserted with the input element, so I'm going to add that now. So I mentioned that our name is going to act like a container. We're going to use it as a variable that's going to hold our values. Our values are what we're entering into the inputs. So when I enter in my form now, Horatio Flibberwitz with my super cool password and cook my pizza before you bring it, and I order my pizza, every single value that I entered in is going to be stored inside of what my name's attribute value was. So while I passed over the first name, the last name, the password, and my instructions, I used nonsensical or non-meaningful attribute values, so it isn't very helpful, especially for the back-end processing that's going to happen in the future. We need to make the values meaningful and something that's going to describe our data. It always needs to start with a lowercase letter. We don't want to have any spaces in there, and it's best to always follow that camel case naming format. Pretty typically, it's common to make it a practice that the value matches whatever the ID value is. Let's look at a couple things. First, what is the difference between camel case, Pascal case, and regular case typing? When I'm referring to normal casing, I'm referring to pretty much what you're used to seeing on a day-to-day basis, where a sentence starts with an uppercase letter and our proper nouns are also in uppercase. All of the remaining letters in a sentence are in lowercase. For example, this is my example. When I'm talking about Pascal case, I don't put spaces in between my words. I keep them all pushed together, but every single start to a new word begins with a capital letter. And the last one, camel case, this is the same thing as Pascal case, only the first letter is going to start with a lowercase letter. My recommendation moving forward is to use camel case for everything that you're working on, unless very specifically another course, another instructor, or someplace that you work requires you to use Pascal case for a different reason. Most of the time, we need to use lowercase letters when we're starting out, and it's best to just use that habit throughout, where we have camel case and lowercase starts. Okay, let's get back to that name attribute. I'm going to remove my comments, and I want to change my name attribute's value to be something more meaningful. And I mentioned it's common to make it the same value as the ID. So in this case, if our ID is equal to first name, we should really have our name attribute also equal to first name. And I'm going to fix all of these on my form. This time, when I submit my form, and I order my pizza, I now have very meaningful values to match my very meaningful name attributes. When this is passed to the server, anyone working on the back-end logic can quickly and easily identify what should go inside of that variable. This is definitely a storage for the first name. This is definitely a storage for our instructions. And there's no mistaking its intent and purpose. And that's pretty much the gist of it, because we now have a working form. Let's look at a few more things that we can do inside of our form. In addition to that name attribute, there's also a placeholder attribute. This is going to provide a short hint of how it is that we want our field to be filled in. We're going to add the placeholder attribute to our first three input elements and to the text area element. And we'll give each one of these an appropriate value to describe the data expected for that field. And notice how our list of attributes seems to be growing. We don't have to stack these in a line straight across. If we want to break them down to make it easier to read, we can do that. We can add them to a new line to help with that readability and that legibility. I'm going to go ahead and add placeholder. And keep an eye on this first name box, because this is where the placeholder text's value is going to go. You can see it's containing that information, and it's in a light gray. This is helper text. It's designed to be a string of information helping the end user to fill out this form. So it doesn't need to be in camel case or Pascal case, because it's just a string that's a visual representation or a visual helper for the end user. So we need it to be meaningful, and we need it to be in a format that's very easy to read. I'll add placeholders to the other three elements. So with the placeholder, the value that's in here is only temporary. So as soon as we click inside of this input box, that value is going to go away visually. But once we remove the value that we've put in because we haven't submitted our form, we're going to get that placeholder back. Placeholders are an excellent addition to any form because it's additional help that the end user is going to get when filling out a form. It can be really frustrating for an end user filling out a form if they're not really sure what's expected of them before they start typing. And it's worse if they're entering in information and it can't pass to the server for whatever reason. So as much help as we can provide to the end user, so much the better. Let's take a look at some more attributes, starting with the size attribute. And I'm going to pair it with the MaxLength attribute because I want to talk about how these two things together can help and hinder each other. But first, let me rearrange my screen to give us a little more room for some of these fields. So the size attribute can alter the size of the field when we put a value inside of it. So let's add a size attribute to that first name input, and we're going to set it to the number 5. Notice that it immediately truncates the input's text field, so there isn't a lot of room to see what you're typing. Now let's add a max length of 25. Because the max length specifies the total number of allowable length in text. You can also specify the minimum length, but I'm not going to cover that just right now. Watch what happens when I'm typing into this first name input box with a rather long name. Let's say our name was Bartholomew. We've now reached that painful part of inputting form field information where our field is scrolling because our value is larger than the field's visual input allows for. I'm sure you've filled out forms like this when you're typing in information. There's more space that you can type into, but you just can't see. Now if you need to go back to find out if you made a mistake, it's a little harder to do. So if you're going to use the size attribute and you're going to use the max length attribute, make sure that the size of the input is going to allow you to enter in enough information with the max length attribute that you don't run into this problem. Let's say our size was 25 and our max length was 10. Now I can have a long name like Bartholomew and I can see the whole name. Except for one small problem. The max length attribute specifies the maximum allowed length of text. Bartholomew is longer than 10 letters. I'm not allowed to enter in that last letter. So if you're going to use the max length attribute, make sure that whatever you're going to set that max length on, you're going to have enough space for the person to enter in their information. Okay, let's go to the next one. We're going to talk about the value attribute, because you can assign a value to a field by using the values attribute, and this is different from the placeholders attribute in a very key way. Let's say I add the value attribute to my first name, and I set it to my first name. Now with the placeholder, you can see it's sort of gray, but with the value, it's in there in dark regular letters. That's because this value will pass to the server where a placeholder will not. Let's try it. Notice how the first name already has the value entered into it, and these other three values are just placeholder fields. I can overwrite anything that's in here and it'll pass to the server. But with the value, if I don't change it, that value will pass to the server as is. So let's say I order pizza. While I don't have anything in my last name, password, or instructions, my first name did already have the value set to Temple, so it passes to the server. So I'm going to caution you against using value unless you absolutely need to have it. The end user can overwrite the value with whatever they want to and have that pass to the server. Let's say I put in Mila and I select order pizza. I overwrote that value, so it doesn't prevent the end user from putting in their value, but it can be confusing because it makes it look like the value is already there and it shouldn't be changed. And one more attribute that I'm going to cover in this video, it's the required attribute. The required attribute is indicating that a field has to have something in it before we send it to the server. Let me strip out that value equal to Temple and set required as my attribute. Now when I try to submit my form and I don't have any information entered in, it's going to say, please fill out this field. This is the browser saying, I refuse to let you pass this over to the server because you don't have anything in this field. If I go back and add in that value, notice how the value is already there. And if I hit order pizza now, it's going to pass that value and say, okay, you have something in here, we're good to go. So that's some of the really big important differences between placeholder and value and how required might play into that. One more quick note about required. It doesn't need a value. Required is just a Boolean. It either is or it isn't. If it's required, then you just put required. You don't need to write required equals yes or required equals true. It's just required. So that was quite a lot in terms of new attributes that we've just learned. So if you have any questions on this, please don't hesitate to ask.